Hi Year 10, what we're going to do today is look at Wind by Ted Hughes, and your task on Show My Homework is to think about how the weather is presented in the poem, thinking about language and structure. What I'm going to do is annotate it with you and then show you how to put those ideas into a paragraph. So just a reminder that in your GCSE you will have a section on unseen poetry. You will get one poem first to analyse individually, and then you will have another one to compare it against. So it's just really good practice to analyse an unseen poem in terms of language and structure. Even better if you can then put that into paragraphs. If you wanted an even further challenge, just keep considering how things are compared to one another. I'm just going to mute my emails. So I'm not going to read it through with you because you're able to do that on your own. I'm going to make comments down the side, so make sure you pause the video if you wanted to note down anything that I do. I'm going to highlight language in yellow. I'm going to highlight structure in green. So far out at sea all night. Now I'm just going to note that down anyway because that is a metaphor. It hasn't literally been out at sea, but we do get imagery of coastline, and the idea of the house being far out at sea. It could represent isolation. It could also maybe suggest that the weather is strong and foreboding, almost a little bit threatening. And so because that's all to do with the words that have been said, it's going to be a language, so it's going to be in yellow. The woods crashing through darkness, the booming hills. Okay, so here we're getting a lot of verbs that are extremely violent and kind of suggest struggling. So choices of verbs here, and they are crashing, booming, stampeding, so on and so forth. And these are all quite violent, extreme, and very physical as well. So this is suggesting that the weather is strong and powerful, almost quite threatening as well. Good. So in terms of structure here, we've got two sentences, two lines that have commas at the end of the lines, and then we have two that have enjambment, but you'll notice that there has not been a full stop at all. So within this whole first stanza, it's one long sentence. Commas suggest obviously a pause, a caesura, and then enjambment, it could suggest that the wind is continuous, and that there is no end to the weather. So it's just continuing on. This idea of stampeding, it could be that the words are almost stampeding, they're not stopping, till day rose. And then finally we have a caesura, this pause. So the pause here separates the first oppressive and threatening, sorry I can't spell today, threatening atmosphere before changing focus. Now, because I've said changing focus here, just by that caesura, there is a change of focus, a change of tone, and that is a structural technique. That could be that the weather has passed, and the whole time when we're talking about things like weather, I would constantly be thinking about, well, what does the weather represent? With poetry, weather is never just weather, it's always symbolic of something. So I'm just going to put, what is it symbolizing? And you should try and think about that, especially if you wanted to aim for a higher mark, if you wanted to really delve deep into that. So just by this caesura, I'm just going to try and highlight that in green because that's structure. I can't seem to just highlight a random bit there, so just before the enjambment I'll highlight the word in green to show structure. Here under an orange sky wielded, we also have enjambment. So again, the enjambment, that the orange sky, it's wielded, it's holding blade light. So now we've got a positive atmosphere being continued. It also could symbolize that the sky is endless. Orange, obviously this adjective could suggest that it's either dawn or dusk, that it's sunset. It's also a lighter color, suggesting that the rage or the darkness has passed. The hills had new places and wind-wielded blade light, luminous, black and emerald. Now luminous obviously means to shine, and black is kind of the opposite. So here we've got an oxymoron, two things opposite next to one another. Okay, and that is a language technique. So thinking about the hills had new places, and now we've got this opposite. It could be demonstrating the changes the weather has brought about. So that's something to think about. An emerald, we've got green, flexing like the lens of a mad eye. Here obviously is a simile, so I'm just going to make a note of that as well. Mad though, it kind of is a bit of an anaphora, something that's repeated but not using the same words, almost like a theme. So here I'd be thinking that it kind of repeats the idea of chaos, similar to what the weather was like in the first stanza. So that could be referring to that. Also, I like the use of the word I here when we've obviously had a storm, so it could be a little nod to that. At noon, so now we get a little bit more about the day, so that could be the start of the day. Now we could be at noon. I scaled along the house side as far as the coal house door. Once I looked up. Now here we've got a caesura, we've got a pause at the end of this line, and this is building tension following the first introduction of the narrator. What is he looking at? It creates curiosity. Through the brunt wind that dented the balls of my eyes. Now obviously it didn't, so that's obviously a metaphor, but obviously dented, it's had some kind of impact, it's injured. So again, that's thinking about the weather. Sorry, I've spelt that wrong as well. So I'm going to highlight that in yellow. The tent of the hills drummed and strained its guy rope. Now here, the tent of the hills is meant to represent the shape of the hills. Obviously, it's a metaphor. They're not actually tents. But it does make us think of shelter. And drummed, again, we've got that really nice choice of verb there. We've got a sound, so we're using this sensory language. I'm just going to put that in a little text box rather than trying to add another comment. So here I'm just going to put a little note of sensory language, using the senses. So here we've got something that is audio based, hearing, and that is shown through the choice of verbs. So drummed and strained its guy rope. A guy rope is almost like a tent rope. It's a tent rope, something that latches something on. So here it could be suggesting that the earth is straining, it's struggling to maintain itself under the weather. The fields quivering, okay, quivering here, that nice verb again suggesting fear. The skyline a grimace. Grimace is kind of a scowl, it's an uncomfortable smile, so almost like a harrowing smile. It's usually quite sinister. At any second to bang and vanish with a flap. Okay, here we've got onomatopoeia. So I'll put that in this box as well, onomatopoeia. These sudden noises reiterate this, kind of the quick change in weather, just like we had between stanzas 1 and 2. The wind flung a magpie away, and a black-back gull bent like an iron bar slowly. We've got this harsh verb again, that flung, again, which is personifying the wind here. So I'll add that comment. So we've got a personification here of the wind, as though the weather is a person. And what we don't want to just do is say the wind is personified. We want to say in what way. So it's personified as quite a violent and destructive creature almost, flinging around birds and nature. Here we've got this repetition, this kind of anaphora of dented and bent. It's injuring, it's impairing things in nature, and obviously this is a simile as well. Here we've got an end stop in the middle of a sentence. We've got a caesura here, and what we want to think about is, why does it stop there and then start a new line? So it does this because the line then has enjambment, reinforcing the strong winds, and also it suggests quite a chaotic structure, which again reflects the weather. The house rang like some fine green goblet. Okay, we've got here another simile. We've got rang, that audio hearing based sound, but here we've got that note any second would shatter it. This word note, it almost implies quite a musical element to it, that although it's extremely destructive, that there is a little bit of enjoyment or fascination, I think is probably the better word, with this. Any second would shatter it. So here we've got shatter again, that impairing violent verb. Once again, we've got a caesura in the middle of a line, and not just any caesura, we've got a full stop. So again, we are having this enjambment carrying on more and more. You can see, compared to here where we had two, here we had two, here we only had one, now we've got three. So the enjambment is becoming more and more obvious. Enjambment is increasing, and again that could suggest that the wind is increasing in force, or the poem is becoming less structured, which again reflects that chaotic nature. In chairs in front of the great fire. Now here I'd be thinking, okay, well, why is it great? This adjective, obviously it provides warmth, it provides comfort against the background of this storm. So we've got some juxtaposition here between the idea of home and shelter versus this kind of violent weather outside. We grip, again I would think about that verb, the fact that it's suggesting struggle, it's suggesting desperation. Our hearts and cannot entertain book, thought or each other. Got a list of three there, which again is both language and structure. I'm going to think of it as structure. So why has he used a list? It's reinforcing how many things are affected. And in this case, he's thinking about things within the home. So not physically, but emotionally. He's not actually being hurt, but he can't focus on anything because of the wind. We watch the fire blazing and feel the roots of the house move. Now here that's a metaphor because the house doesn't have roots, but it's a nice link to nature, almost suggesting that mankind has built a version of nature. And with Hughes, he typically always kind of thought that there was a relationship between nature and man, and that mankind needed to respect nature, but you wouldn't necessarily know that in unseen poetry. Here you'll notice though we've got caesuras and end stop lines at the end of every single line, so this could suggest that the wind has settled, that they are more comforted. You're also noticing the window tremble, there's still fear, and it finishes with hearing the stones cry out, which obviously is personification. So there's still some fear here, connoted by the stones, the window. However, the more structured stanza suggests more control or comfort. So that is where structure is really important, because it allows us to think, okay, although this suggests they're still really scared, there is an element of bravery or what's the word? Probably satisfaction maybe, or you're just feeling more comforted. So those are some ideas to think about. What you would then want to try and do is, any extra time, write your ideas as a paragraph. So let me show you how to do that about the weather. So I'm going to take this last paragraph, so this last stanza. So within the last stanza of the poem, there is still a notion, an idea of fear demonstrated in the personified stones and window who tremble and cry. Now you'll notice already I've embedded my quotations, I've made my point, and I've mentioned the device. So what I need to think about now is, well, what do these words suggest? So these verbs, instead of show, I'm going to use connote, an element of, instead of saying fear, I want to use a different word. So remember, you can always use your synonyms there. So I'm going to use concern, connote an element of concern felt by the house. However, the use of caesuras and lack of enjambment compared to the previous stanzas suggest that the narrator may be feeling more comforted through being sheltered from the weather, violent weather, I'll say. So here I've talked about language, I've talked about structure, I've mentioned how it compares to the previous stanzas, so I've noticed how things have changed throughout the poem. The only thing I need to do now is talk about the reader and the writer. So readers may assume that the weather is passing due to this idea of comfort. However, they also might consider that the house is under stress by the violent, well, I've already said violent, turbulent conditions outside. Turbulent just means kind of chaotic and violent. Hughes has intended to, now I don't want to say intended because that means I'm really confident, so I might say Hughes might have intended to display a brave narrator. However, he also might be highlighting the power that weather has over us, or over humanity, so on and so forth. So what I've done there is I've done what I typically call P-words. So I've got my point, I've got my evidence, I've analysed, that's good, analysed, it just wants me to change that to a Z, yeah, because that's the American spelling. I've talked about the writer and I've talked about the reader. So I'm just going to show you where I've done these things so that it's obvious to you. So I'm going to do my point in blue. So here is where I have done my point. I've made it clear what I'm going to talk about. Evidence is really clear because that is where I've used my quotations, so I'm going to put those in pink. So here is where I refer to the poem. I've also talked about the poem here compared to the previous stanzas. That tells the examiner or whoever's marking it that you've actually thought about how the poem's developed. Analysis is the main part because that is the skill that is being tested. So I'm going to put that in, let's say this green. So that is kind of everything else in between these bits, just here, and the effect. So all of that part is analysis. Then I went on to do the reader. You can see that I diverted away from this structure, which is absolutely fine. Whatever feels more natural to introduce first. And then I thought about the writer. Now, I wanted to make sure that I achieve the best marks possible. So what I've done is, where I've talked about the reader and the writer, I've included two ideas, and that is demonstrated by where I've said things like however, and I've put however there, very imaginative, using the same word twice. I could also go on to do it up here when I talk about the enjambment and the personification, but that just demonstrates to whoever's marking your work that you can extend your ideas beyond one notion. So it's always really good to do. Using modal verbs like might and may also make it easier because you're not having to confidently assess something, you are just exploring an idea, so that sometimes can help. So what I would do, look back over the video and pause where I've made my annotations. I would then think about, okay, well, which ones do I feel I can confidently talk about? I would challenge you to try and put in a language technique and a structural technique into your paragraphs, because that demonstrates that you are looking at two features of the poem and both the parts of the question rather than just one at a time. So have a go. I hope this has been helpful. Keep safe and I'll speak to you soon. Bye bye.